Welcome to Ballot Meridian lecture coverage on HOMTV. I'm Elizabeth Crenshaw. Joining us for this candidate interview is Siemon, Democratic candidate for Ingham County Prosecutor. Welcome. Would you like to introduce yourself to our viewers?
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and thanks for HOMTV for having me here. My name's Siemon. I'm the Democratic nominee for Ingham County Prosecutor, and I'm running in this race to bring progressive changes to the criminal justice system and to enhance justice, equity, and fairness, and to bring the community together so that we can bring hope for the young people for growing up in a safe community that has lots of options for them for the future.
Thank you. Well, each Ingham County Prosecutor candidate will be asked a standard list of 10 questions. Let's get started with question number 1. So our first question, what qualifications do you bring to the position of Ingham County Prosecutor?
Thank you, Elizabeth. I was an Ingham County Assistant Prosecutor for 11 years, including 4 years as Chief of the Juvenile Division. And in my capacity in those 11 years, I oversaw cases that involved everything from armed robbery and homicide, sexual assault, child abuse and neglect, juvenile justice, mental health commitments, thousands of cases, hundreds of jury trials and non-jury trials. I brought a deep understanding to how the office functions and what kinds of strengths and weaknesses that criminal justice, especially our local prosecutor's office, have. I also worked for several years at the Prosecuting Attorneys Association, which is a statewide organization of prosecutors. I worked in all 3 branches of state government in different focuses, including legislation, training, worked for the Department of Human Services, the Office of Children's Ombudsman as an investigator and legal counsel, and worked as the chief of the Child Welfare Training Institute for the Department of Health and Human Services. I also worked for Public Policy Associates, where I staffed on juvenile justice and race equity coalition issues. So I believe that the 35 years of being a lawyer, along with all the policy development, the training, the ability to understand how best practices work both nationally, and statewide, and locally, will enhance my ability to bring the necessary changes to the criminal justice system here in Ingham County.
Moving on to question number 2. In your opinion, what is the biggest challenge facing the prosecutor's office, and how do you plan to address it?
Well, public safety is always a primary function, if not the primary function of the prosecutor, but we also have to look at public safety in the context of how it works in the community. I think we know that you can have a safe community, but very, very punitive, restrictive, harsh. It's not something that we want. What we're looking for in Ingham County is to build on what we have already in terms of changes to our criminal justice system, but where we are bringing in the community's values, the community's focus, so that we can work on making the changes. We're going to have challenges with budget, of course. We're going to have challenges with figuring out exactly the route to take so that we can make those changes, but it will be the strength of the community and the voices of the community where we can weigh the voices of victims, the rights of defendants, the kinds of changes that have worked other places, and the kinds of feasible changes that we can make here in Ingham County based on what we already have in place and what the communities will support.
Moving on to question number 3. What is your opinion on alternative sentencing methods?
Well, we have some alternative sentencing methods already. We do have treatment courts, specialty courts, which I think are very helpful. Those are involving veterans, drug courts, sobriety courts, mental health courts. There's a teen court in juveniles. There's a substance abuse court in the child welfare system. Those are all very helpful. We also look at diversion programs, and we've had a diversion program for many years, and we can look at expanding diversion. But in addition to some of the tried and true methods that we can look at expanding, we really need to look at how the prosecutor's office can be a leader in the community to look at the cases before they actually even come to the prosecutor's office. So in other words, it's very helpful to divert a case once it's come to the system, or to refer somebody to a specialty court for treatment when they're already in the system. But what we also need to look at is how do we reduce people coming into the system in the first place? What kinds of policies policies can we change? What kinds of things can happen with how we work with the school districts? What do we do with working with law enforcement? What other kinds of options do we have that actually reduce the cases coming in?
Moving on to question number 4. How does jail overcrowding affect the county prosecutor's decision?
Well, I think first we have to look at what the overcrowding is, why we have overcrowding in different circumstances. So we need to look at who is incarcerated. We're talking primarily about people who have committed serious felonies, sexual assaults. Are we talking about people who are incarcerated because of drunk driving, child support violations? Are there people who are incarcerated because they've been picked up on a bench warrant or aren't able to pay court costs? So once we have a better sense for what the population is, then we can work together with law enforcement to see what some other options might be to actually incarcerating in terms of bonds or other kinds of community programs, electronic tethering, things of that nature. But we also need to look at what sometimes the prosecutor is going to feel that public safety demands that a request is made for detention or incarceration, and that is going to be a challenge if the space is not available, because we can't ultimately make a decision on what the right thing to request is based on whether or not there's space.
And we're at the halfway point, so question number 5. What is your approach toward negotiating plea bargains versus trial litigations in criminal cases?
Well, I don't know it's an either or. I think they both have a place. The system would grind to a halt if we didn't have plea negotiations. Plea negotiations are important. We have to charge cases appropriately and then look at all the different circumstances, including sentencing guidelines, looking at the history of this particular individual, what other factors, what the victim's concerns are, what the public safety concerns are, and offering a plea is an appropriate thing to do in circumstances where we can get the kind of oversight and result that we need without having to go to trial. On the other hand, we need to go to trial at times. There's times when there's just not an agreement on what we can be worked out that seems fair and equitable to both sides, and in those cases we have to be willing to go to trial.
So moving on to question number 6 out of 10. Should the prosecutor's office put more or less resources towards the prosecution of drug-related cases?
Again, it's a black or white question, and I think it's not that's the answer is that how we allocate the resources, not whether there should be more or fewer resources. Certainly, I believe the resources should be directed towards the investigation and prosecution of the serious drug offenses, the ones involving opioids and heroin, the ones where we have dealers who are essentially dealing in death with the number of drug overdoses we're having, with the guns that they carry and the violence that we see nationally that are really linked to the serious drug dealers. On the other hand, as I've talked with the community and as we've looked at what the research supports, it's pretty clear that addicts and people who have substance use disorders benefit more from treatment than they do from incarceration or a deep involvement in the criminal justice system, and that we should explore those options more fully instead of putting our resources towards arresting those individuals. So what the allocation of resources is, I can't say if it would be fewer or greater resources, but we should have a shift, and I think that shift is starting to occur, but we should continue. And I would meet with the chiefs of police, I'd meet with the Tri-County Metro. Obviously we'd have to talk with the judges, and because they do have a lot of roles in how we treat substance issues, and see what seems to be the best course of action for our community.
Moving on to question number 7 out of 10. What is your philosophy on juvenile justice?
Okay. Well, I do believe that juveniles are not just small or young adults, that the juvenile justice system was created over 100 years ago specifically because there was an acknowledgement that juveniles are different than adults. We need to look at again, before kids reach the criminal justice system or the juvenile justice system. Most people now have heard of the school to prison pipeline. We need to look at what policies are in place in schools that disproportionately impact on certain groups of students, mostly people who are poor, people of color. We have found through research that school districts that have zero tolerance policies or very strong suspension policies for certain kinds of offenses have youth who are disproportionately then involved in the criminal justice system, juvenile justice system, have bad outcomes as they grow up, like homelessness and joblessness, and those tend to be disproportionately persons of color. And what we're finding is that those suspensions that lead to the school to prison pipeline are often not for criminal activities, but they're for things like insubordination or other subjective types of offenses that really aren't putting people in school at risk. So we need to focus our attention in schools on sexual assaults or things that are putting the students and staff at risk, but not the kinds of offenses that drag youth deeper into the system. Within the juvenile justice system itself, it is focused on rehabilitation as the primary component. I would continue that. I think we need to keep as many juveniles as possible in the juvenile justice system. We have 3 different methods in Michigan to send juveniles to the adult system called waivers when we believe that there's an offense and a youth who needs to be handled in the adult system. But I think that those should be used very rarely and not used as just we have a serious crime and therefore we're going to send the kid to the adult system. I also do support the raising of the age at which we can charge someone as an adult in Michigan from 17 to 18, although that will have to happen in a way that allows the financial burden to the counties to be addressed before that happens, or else that will really impact the county budget very severely. But juveniles are not the same. We know that. The research shows brain development is significantly different in juveniles and not complete until mid-20s. And so the resources of the criminal justice system should be used mostly for adults and the juvenile justice system for juveniles.
We're going to move on to question number 8. What is your approach to addressing human trafficking concerns with Ingham County?
Well, as the rest of the nation, we all need to learn more about it, first of all. That law enforcement and prosecutors specifically need to be trained in human trafficking and what we can do to investigate and prosecute. But we also need to have the public become more aware of what it is. We have sex trafficking, we have labor trafficking. What does it look like? What kinds of things can we look for? We need to inform people in the hotel business, the trucking business, other industries where human trafficking is often visible. Well, recently airlines have started training flight attendants to look for signs of human trafficking. Young people are particularly vulnerable, especially people who may be involved with foster care or people who have run away from home. Immigrants or people who do not speak the language or do not have strong community ties in the community are particularly vulnerable to being trafficked. So we need to really look at where the vulnerable populations are and how we can address that. There's a wonderful national resource center for human trafficking that has a toll-free number that I have written down but don't have in front of me. And there's the Polaris Center is a national place where people can go for more information. They have all kinds of resource material on what human trafficking is and what kinds of things we can do to work with survivors. We need to have a much less punitive approach to the people who have been trafficked to make sure that we really understand that our system needs to be a trauma-informed system to work with survivors. So there are a number of things that we need to do to focus on human trafficking, but it really is going to focus on the education of what it is and what it looks like and how we can see it first so we can notice it in our community.
Thank you. We're going to move on to question number 9. What, if any, support does the Prosecutor's Office need from the public?
Well, a lot, because really the things that I'm talking about when I'm talking about making progressive changes in the criminal justice system are not the kinds of get tough things that can be done by the prosecutor and the police. We're looking at having to have the community forums to hear the voices of the people. What are the experiences and stories that people are having in the community? What types of things that we've done are successful, what types of things are not successful. We're going to need to have some political will to reallocate resources, to maybe go to the legislature and say we need to appropriate more money to fund the Center for Forensic Psychiatry or to fund community mental health, substance abuse treatment programs. It doesn't do a lot of good to talk about making these changes if we don't have the resources available and the treatment available in the community. So we're going to need to have the support. But I think mostly that the community develops the trust in the system by being a part of the system, feeling that they do have a meaningful voice, that when there are concerns expressed about things such as implicit bias or trying to avoid problems in neighborhoods, that they're being listened to, that their concerns are being addressed, and that they have an active role, that victims of crimes know that they are being heard, that the rights of defendants are being protected, and that this is a community support effort, and that's, I think, the biggest role the community can play.
We're going to move on to our last question, question number 10. If elected, what are your top 2 goals you wish to accomplish during your term in office?
Well, again, it's all going to be under the umbrella of trying to create progressive changes, and some of the ways to do that are going to obviously be addressing the gun violence and the serious problems that we have nationally with gun violence that we also have here in Ingham County. We're going to need to deal with the drug and opioid problems that we have, which again have led to 68 deaths in 2015 from drug overdoses here in Ingham County. We're going to, in the process of addressing those serious criminal behaviors, we're going to need to look at what kinds of changes need to occur in the Prosecutor's Office in terms of hiring practices, policies, and other practices that are going to be more aware of creating the racially diverse office and the kinds of policies in the community that are going to promote justice and equality for everyone in the community.
Thank you. Well, at this time, we finished the standard list of questions with Carol Siemon, who is a Democratic candidate for Ingham County Prosecutor. We have some time remaining, and I have a few follow-up questions, if you wouldn't mind.
Don't mind at all.
So my first question would be, you mentioned that the drug and opioid problems in the community resulted in 68 deaths in 2015. What would you promote or propose to going forward in that Ingham County Prosecutor roles as a way to help reduce that number or enforce some methods to help people that may be in need with are struggling with that problem?
Okay. Well, we have some wonderful resources, so it's a matter of coordinating them. Again, like I said, we have drug courts, which have been extremely successful. They deal with small numbers, but they're very successful with those small numbers. We have community groups such as the Families Against Narcotics, which is a very powerful group in terms of supporting people who have either lost a family member or a loved one to a drug overdose, or who are dealing with the issue of drugs in their family. They have a variety of approaches they're using, including having it's Narcan, the shot that you can use this for an overdose, which can help save lives, literally. As we may know, police officers and other first responders now are using that quite often, and that's saving lives. But that obviously is addressing the problem that when we have people using, we need to bring together forums that look at everything from the pharmaceutical industry and the medical profession to say, how do we legitimately deal with pain management? Because a lot of people who get into opiate use and then later to heroin addiction are people who have had legitimate pain management issues from surgery or accidents. We also need to figure out how we monitor how these drugs are getting out there initially, not in a punitive way, but have a database and be able to share that information. Look for alternatives such as everything from acupuncture to mindfulness that work very well to address pain management, especially for chronic pain management. We need to know that if someone comes forward, that we're going to try to get them into treatment as opposed to locking them up, because they need to feel that there's a safe place. And you need to be able to reach people at the moment they're ready for treatment. Then we also need to continue to have strong involvement with getting the drugs off the street, and especially now when we're finding so many drugs are being adulterated even more than I think it's been done over the last few decades, where you have extraordinarily powerful horse tranquilizers or other drugs that are leading to those overdoses. So it's a multi-pronged effect and interpretation, but I think we need to work together with what we have and then see where the gaps are.
Thank you. My next question would be, we talked about in question number 1, what qualifications do you bring to the Ingham County Prosecutor position? And you mentioned that you had spent 75 years as a lawyer. Now, out of 75? 35 years, okay, and then that would be a long time. 35 years, I'm looking at another number. 35 years as a lawyer. So out of those 35 years, what areas do you think are beneficial for you that you bring to the table from your experiences?
Well, as I mentioned, I was a litigator for over 11 years, and that obviously really informed understanding how the court process works and what kinds of issues we have to address there. But I also looked at both state and national policy and cutting-edge evidence-based practices in virtually every job I had. So that gave me an opportunity not just to look at specifically the legal system, but the service delivery system, how investigations are occur. And for me, my focus over the years has primarily been in the areas of child abuse and neglect and juvenile justice, and that is because my belief is that those really are the underpinnings of pretty much everything that goes on in society, that if we address the issues in children and juveniles and the families, that we're very likely going to be reducing criminal activity, substance abuse, mental health concerns, domestic violence, human trafficking, and all the other demons that plague our society.
And out of your experiences, how do you plan to gain the trust of the people in Ingham County?
Well, first of all, I think that I've gained the trust of many just by the fact that I have been in the community working for so many years. But the other main function is just by doing it. I'm going to come in and people are going to have to see from day to day. The staff in the prosecutor's office is going to have to see who I am for them. The community is going to, the police. So I work diligently and hard. I'm honest and fair. I know how to draw upon resources. I'm willing to admit when I'm wrong and learn from my mistakes. I think that I have a real focus on bringing all the people to the table who need to be at the table, to having the difficult conversations about issues such as how do we spend money, what do we do about implicit bias and race inequity, and have those conversations with the people who need to be at the table and be respectful and dignified with all of them. Those are the kinds of things that I think will demonstrate over time that we're saying we're not just talking about campaign rhetoric, that this really is what we're going to do for the community.
And from your observations, what are some areas that you can see that the community needs right now that you would bring into place in the office?
Well, you mentioned trust, and I think there is a concern. We've seen, obviously, nationally, the Fergusons, and every week, unfortunately, some kind of new situation. There's a polarization that is sad to see that says somehow we're pitting the police against community members, especially people of color, and that we can't afford to do that. We can't afford to do that because we do have to work together on these issues. I just lost track of the question. I'm sorry.
No worries. So the question will be, is just noticing from your observation, your experience in law, some areas in the Ingham County that could be strengthened or improved on.
Oh, okay. So it'll be bringing people together to talk about now if we're going to make the changes in how we talk about dealing with addicts, then what is going to be available? How are we going to galvanize the community will to make sure that we have a full continuum of services available? We're going to have to build the trust working with the police. I think most of the police agencies in the Ingham County area have worked very hard on de-escalation techniques and some of the other things that we really need to focus on to keep our community from becoming one of the ones that makes the national headlines. I know that they've been having public forums with the ACLU, with the faith-based community, to look at the kinds of concerns that are being expressed. We know from research that when you have police agencies that have a higher educational level, where they have programs in place where they work with mental health, understanding mental health issues, which they do here with the Community Mental Health Board, de-escalation issues, that's very productive, and we know that having those strong community, building those strong community relationships work. So those are the kinds of things that I will be continuing to work on.
Well, thank you very much for your time. Now we're gonna have a few minutes, we have a few minutes remaining, and if you would like to just give a brief statement, closing statement, this is your opportunity.
We have had an opportunity, and I'm not sure when this will be actually shown, but last night with the first presidential debate, to look at the role of the president and what we're going to do about criminal justice in the United States. And I think the benefit of having such a clear dichotomy between how two candidates at the national level and perhaps at the local level look at the issues of criminal justice can help inform our discussion, because we do have some clear choices. We have on one hand Donald Trump, who was talking about law and order, talking about stop and frisk as a good method of providing safety in our community. Which terrifies me, I'll be honest. We know that stop and frisk doesn't work. We know that stop and frisk, where you just can stop somebody walking down the street and take off guns or drugs without any reasonable suspicion or probable cause for an arrest or a stop, is very damaging. And it's terrifying for me to think that that kind of policy would become one that we would live under. So I was pleased to see that there was an alternative where there was a discussion about what criminal justice would look like, that we do need to increase the kinds of programs, the kinds of changes that really focus on addressing the underlying causes of criminality instead of the harsh punitive system that we've had in place, that we've initiated over the last 25 years. The war on drugs, the mass incarceration, the policies that have led to the United States having the highest incarceration rate in the world, 730 out of every 100,000 people. 1/5 of the world's incarcerated women are right here in the United States. We need to change those policies, and those are the kinds of changes that need to have the support at the very top, but need to be very much addressed in the local community as well.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
This has been a candidate interview with Carol Siemon, Democratic candidate for Ingham County Prosecutor. I'm Elizabeth Crenshaw, inviting you to watch Ballot Meridian election coverage right here on HOMTV.